I'll try and be as quick as possible because I know we're already running late. Nimco Ali was born in Somaliland and is a survivor of FGM herself, which she underwent at the age of 7. She's dedicated her career to ending the practice, and she studied law at the University of Bristol and went on to work as a civil servant before co-founding Daughters of Eve with Layla Hussein, which is a non-profit dedicated to providing education and raising awareness about FGM. She received the 2014 Red Magazine Women of the Year Award, and in 2019 she published her book, What We're Told Not to Talk About, But We're Going to Do So Anyway. She was also appointed an OBE and awarded the 2019 Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy's International Women's Award. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Esomchi and Nimco, and then after some moderated Q&A, I'll take questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming her.
So I suppose for you, being an expert essentially in FGM, lifelong campaigner, working against it, you're very familiar with the practice, but just for anyone who's not really heard of it, kind of what is FGM?
Yeah, so Daughters of Eve was the organisation I founded in 2010, and since then I've co-founded the FIVE Foundation, which is the global partnership to help end FGM. So FGM is any form of harm or mutilation of the female anatomy for non-medical reasoning. This impacts over 230 million women in the world, and most of us are living in Africa. I think you can really get technical, and that's been the problem for a long time, is that we've talked about the different types of FGM, but this is just basically a grave violation of women's human rights. So it's basically any harm or any kind of damage to the female anatomy for non-medical reasoning. And I use that definition of the non-medical reasoning because there will be needs in order to to carry out surgery, whether it's gender reassignment or whether it's cancer. There will be medical need in order to carry out acts of female genital mutilation, but these are non-medical reasonings for that act to happen.
Yeah. So could you kind of take us through your career? You've had a lot of experience in the non-profit sector. I'd say probably the most prominent anti-FGM activist in the UK. So kind of what was your journey from experiencing it as a child and actually working to prevent the practice?
Yeah, so my journey into the FGM space was actually kind of by accident, in the sense that I had FGM when I was 7. I had a really invasive form of FGM. So one of the things that I haven't done now is talk about the different types of FGM. So there are 3 legal the definitions of FGM. One is type 1, which is a nicking or a dehooding of the clitoris, which is the female main anatomy, and then the second is removal of part of the external genitalia of the female anatomy, and the third, which is the most invasive form, which is very common in East Africa, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, and also in Eritrea, and Egypt as well, is called type 3, which is called infibulation, which is where they stitch the anatomy together. So that's what I had when I was 7, and because I was so invasive, it meant that I ended up developing some kidney infections, and I basically collapsed in the middle of primary school. So I had to have another form of intervention, but this time through the medical system within the NHS. And for me, as somebody who grew up here, so basically I've lived in this country without FGM, and I've also lived in this country with FGM. And it wasn't something that I was embarrassed about, it was just something that I was massively confused by. So when I came back as a 7-year-old to this country, I told my teacher, and my teacher, I think within the concept of cultural relativity, she was kind of like, well, that's what happens to girls like you. And that is not something that I thought I would, that's something that I consistently came across the more I talked about FGM as a survivor and as a victim as a child. So then when I was 11, here I am in this big hospital in Cardiff having this intervention, and I remember looking at the clinical staff and thinking, okay, now they're going to explain to me so what was wrong with me and why I found it really uncomfortable. So I had no idea FGM was illegal. I just knew something that I just didn't feel comfortable with. That didn't happen. And then I kind of vowed to myself that I was never going to bother with this stuff. I was never going to bother to try to have this kind of conversation around it. So I just kind of left, and that was it. So I was lucky enough with the sense that I had my defibrillation, which is the medical intervention here in the UK, before I menstruated and before any of those things. So I didn't necessarily have many complications outside of the kind of, I think, the emotional scars that I had to kind of unpick later on. So I just thought, you know what, that's something that happened years ago, and this is something that's I'm not engaged with anymore. And there were no more girls born into my family, so that wasn't an issue I had anymore. I didn't have any of my friends and I didn't necessarily talk about it anymore. So I just kind of left it at that. And for me, from the age of, I think, like 13, 14, I didn't engage with FGM ever again. Left that, went to university, graduated, I went into the civil service, and it was really interesting. I was in a kind of a feminist meeting in Bristol, and this teacher came up to me and she said to me, "Oh, are you Somali?" And I said, "Yes." And she says, "Well, you don't look Somali." I'm like, "I don't know what that means." And she said, "I've got a large cohort of Somali girls in my school. Would you come and speak to them?" And I said, "About what?" And she said, "About going to university and all these things." And I thought, okay, fine, I will. But I was also very conscious about the fact that because I hadn't really engaged with Somali community outside my family for a long time, I didn't want to be seen as an outsider by these young girls. I think their families thinking, oh, I've come to kind of brainwash them about all these things. I've always been very conscious about my culture and also my kind of black sheepness out of that, where the fact that I was very always outspoken about things. So I remember going into this inner city school and I was really intimidated by these young girls. They were like 13, 14 and they were really boisterous, really loud, and I just thought I was never like that at that age because obviously I was dealing with the consequences of FGM. So I went into that classroom having this conversation with them, and their teacher was Caucasian, so it was basically me, the teacher, and 14 Somali girls. And then the teacher left, and ultimately there was just a group of Somali girls that was just sitting there, and they started to get more and more boisterous, start having questions and having conversations, some which I thought, girls, like, no, I don't want to be the one that has to answer these questions because I don't want you to tell your parents these things. And then out of nowhere, one of them said, "Miss, is FGM halal?" And she put it within an Islamic context. There's no Islamic justification for FGM. And I said one of the most kind of flippant things, which I regret, and I will always regret for the rest of my life. I said, "How many of you have had FGM? Put your hands up." Not expecting in 2005, I think this was, and I think it was 2006, I think any of these girls like putting their hands up and saying that they had FGM, and 13 out of the 14 girls had FGM. I was shocked, and they were shocked that I was shocked, because I think they were expecting somebody to justify this emotional issues that they were having, similar to what I probably would have been doing at that time. But I was just completely shocked, and I was like, oh God. And then I remember one of the girls who had FGM being shocked, like, I don't know how it happened, but the girl that hadn't had FGM was really surprised as well. And that girl snapped out and she said, "We don't think you're special." And then she vividly explained the act of FGM. And I was like, okay, this is just like crazy. And then the teacher walked in and then they all just flipped again. So they were doing this incredible code switching where they were just back to being Bristolians again. And I was the one that was actually quite like dazed in that room. So I left and I had a conversation with my superior, and I said, this issue of FGM, so and so, blah, blah, blah. Never saying it had anything to do with me. And then we put together some really cool like policies and stuff, and it was really great. And we were engaging with the community. And even then I was very, very, I really didn't want to engage in the conversation personally because I knew what the pushback would be. I knew what the cultural kind of taboos were. I was like, this is not my kind of place. And then around 2009, I left to do my second rotation in London, and feeling incredibly kind of embarrassed the fact that I was in that room with those young women and I didn't do anything. I thought, you know what, I'm going to volunteer. So I volunteered for this organisation in London that was working on FGM, and there was a Somali girl that I was working with, and I'd meet her every other Thursday in Edgware Road, and we'd have like, you know, coffee, and we'd have these conversations. And she had the same type of FGM that I had, and I would always tell her everything's going to be okay. Just having all these kind of conversations with her, never telling her that I was coming, it was from my personal experience. I was telling her everything was going to be okay. And then she said to me, oh, I'm about to do an art show as part of my therapy. Will you come? And I was like, oh, I feel really flippant saying this, but I had a date that night. So I was thinking, do I go to my date, or do I go and help, do I go see this girl? So I went to this event, and she was late. And then the organizer was very much like, where is she? And I was like, I don't know where she is, but also, are you sure that she's not okay? Like, you know, how is she? And I saw this kind of like real flippantness about the experience and the mental health of black women in that room. She came into the room and she was dragged from where she was, given a microphone and put onto the stage. And I was standing there and she was like, just like really hyperventilating. And then I realized that like, that her stuff, I was complicit in the reason why she was standing there, that she had no idea why, she was feeling the way that she was feeling. So I got onto the stage and I told her like, everything's going to be okay. All those issues that I talked about FGM and all these things, I was talking from a personal standpoint. So when I say I became an accidental activist, that was the moment I actually talked about my FGM, but by accident, in telling her, I was telling a whole room full of people. Some of those were some of my colleagues, and I just got really like freaked out by it. And then I kind of went home and I thought, you know what, I was working with Theresa May by the time that that her and I had kind of had this conversation. I was like, I'm in civil service. I could do so many things within the government, and I was really interested in only changing the child protection mechanisms and the protection mechanisms for women in this country, because at that time we were still flippantly talking about FGM as this like cultural act. We were talking about it only impacting 20,000 women, but we know that in the UK that there are more than 160,000 women living with FGM. So that was kind of my first push into talking about the act of FGM. It wasn't anything that I wanted to personally be responsible for ending. It was just something that I felt really guilty by seeing other young women that were suffering and that didn't necessarily have the privileges that I did, because I think having had FGM, I still had my medical intervention very young, and I was still able to kind of live a very healthy lifestyle outside of that. And then I realised that actually a lot of the other girls within any other community that was affected by FGM were not as lucky as I was.
Yeah. So how do you kind of reconcile, I guess, that sense of responsibility for, the well-being of these young girls, but also kind of dealing with a deeply traumatic experience, and also something that, I know you kind of don't want to describe as a cultural practice, but something that is almost related to your community, kind of your upbringing. How do you navigate all that, and even being such a young child developing into adolescence?
Yeah, I'm incredibly proud to be Somali. I'm incredibly proud of being an East African woman, and I think the survival of East African women through the years because of FGM is actually kind of a testament to how strong they are. So I don't identify the actual abuse with my culture, but I do, so that's one of the things that I've said, and I think that's one of the things that people, especially within my community, get a little bit upset about, is because I've never left my community. I've never been ashamed of being Somali. I've never been ashamed of being Muslim. I've always said that these things have nothing to do with my culture and with my faith. And that is something, interestingly enough, it was the cultural relativism of anthropology and so on that were constantly pushing this identity of FGM being my identity as a Somali, or being a Muslim and FGM. And I was like, no, this is a form of abuse. Just as I don't actually identify rape with any culture. This is something that happens to me as my gender. So I've always seen FGM as an extension of the form of violence against women and girls globally. I think that was because, the initial writings about FGM and all these issues, it was African women that I kind of read, in the sense that it was like bell hooks, talking about the oppression of black women in the liberation of America. It was Noelle Adesalawi who basically wrote about her FGM in her book. It was Edna Arden, who's a woman from East Africa, from Somaliland, who wrote about the definition of what FGM was. Each and every one of these women wrote about the issues that were impacting black women, as opposed to really identifying that as this is my kind of trauma or my kind of scars. So that's something that I have always pushed back against, and I think that's why I was very much alienated from different communities, because I never wanted to play the poor victim, and I never also wanted to kind of allow FGM to be something that happened through ignorance. I think that's one of the things that I find really problematic, which kind of still is there, in the sense that when we talk about FGM, is the fact that it's a very organised crime, and my community and perpetrators of FGM will like to play the ignorance card, but it's not anything that's done through ignorance. You have to really be organised in order to be able to get away with the mass abuse of young women.
So yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of call it an organised crime, and I guess your legal background probably influences you kind of approaching it in that way. So kind of, who would you ascribe the blame to, or kind of, is it a people, or not kind of a people, but is it specific figures in communities, or is it ideologies? Like, what is, because you describe how harmful the practice is,
Yeah.
kind of, what is the reason? It just, you know, seems unjustifiable.
Do you know what? It's the fact that, so I've only ever specifically worked in terms of, like, you know, I can only speak as a British person, and I also as a British Somali person. I can talk about within the Somali community, but there are, you know, there are 28 countries in Africa where FGM is more than 40%. So the reasons within, like, Sierra Leone are completely different to the issues without, like, you know, within Somalia or within Ethiopia or whatever. But I think each and every one of those, it's about the control of women and the control of, like, you know, the female power. And it's a really interesting kind of decolonization kind of conversation, is that the Foreign Office last year wanted to do this thing about feminist foreign policies, and we were all sitting around feminist foreign policies, and I was really uncomfortable with this kind of definition and us going to African countries and talking about feminist foreign policies, because before the colonial powers went to Africa, it was women who were at the heart of these kind of conversations, who were basically the leaders, and then we brought the patriarchal kind of context, and then now we're trying to educate people that we actually kind of took the power away from. So I think ultimately the kind of the rise of FGM and its kind of its ability to carry on is because of there's this creation being created of the fear of strong women and strong black women as well. And then when you come to the West, I think there's this mythical kind of thing of the strong black woman. And that is something I think that is really destructive to black women, is the fact that, yes, I'm an FGM survivor, yes, I survived civil war, yes, I've had to kind of do all these other kind of things, but ultimately the reason why black women survive and keep doing these things is because they have to. It's not because they're superhuman. So I push it back on that kind of thing. I think the organisation of this is the same reason why domestic violence, rape and all these things kind of continue. And what I found really interesting, and I keep saying that I find it interesting because it was quite offensive, so I have to say, I always find it was the women's rights sector, which was very liberal, very left, very white working class women who were very uncomfortable with an articulate black woman saying what happened to me was violence. It was really interesting that for a long time they found it hard to describe it as violence against women and girls, and they found it really hard to describe it as a form of violence against children, because they've been put into this picture that anything that anybody does because they're of colour has to have some kind of cultural experience into it. But culture is not about race or heritage, it's about where you are. And in that context, it was abuse and something that had to be talked about.
So kind of what was the state of anti-FGM activism when you kind of entered that sector, and how did you begin to confront these really deep-seated, I think, kind of societal notions, but also academic notions,
Yeah.
you know, the barbarism of certain African cultures, you know, it's just how they do. How do you even begin to fight these kind of ancient ideas?
I think the only thing that I knew at the time was law and policy. So having worked in the Home Office, I really wanted to just change the definitions of things. So I thought if you change the definition of something, then you actually are able to kind of push things through. So trying to add FGM to the domestic violence kind of framework. And it was really interesting, like at the time we had, like, you know, Theresa May for all her ills and other things. Like, you know, I'm one of those people where the fact that I'm not really so well precious about who I work with. If they're in power, they've been democratically elected, I will always work for them. And I think that's another thing that people find quite strange about me, is the fact that I will connect and work with whoever in order to push things. So there was an opportunity to, I was at the table. There was a new form of legislation that was being driven, so I was like, I'm going to add FGM to it. So that FGM was added, and so was modern day slavery, and so was child marriage. So those were the kind of things that you could do. And then when you change the legislation, then people who are applying for these funding in order to work within those frameworks have to work within those kind of frameworks. But then it was really interesting to kind of change the cultural definitions within the kind of working class feminist communities, because I don't think the African kind of intersection had kind of, like, you know, had kind of happened at that time. But then what happened was there was an incredible organisation called UK Feminista that kind of started in 2010. There was Laura Bates was kind of coming around. So there was a lot of us that were kind of raised in the year of the Ladettes that were coming against those things. So I think using the media and then having the legislator together was the way to kind of push that. I'm being very flippant about it, but it was really, really hard. It was a really, really isolating time. It was a really lonely time. And I think a lot of people still kind of forget how hard it was to kind of change those things. But I was just kind of persistent, because in the sense that I knew that I was standing there as an African woman, I was standing there as a British woman, but yet at the same time, when it came to the protection of my basic civil liberties, it didn't matter. It was like, if a white girl had been subjected to the same act of violence as I was, that was horrific. But because I was brown, we had to put some kind of cultural lens on it. So it was trying to get people who were ironically trying to be anti-racist to see how racist they would be in my kind of experience. And it really took somebody that was within the Conservative Party to kind of listen, because they didn't necessarily have any votes to lose at the time. And that was the kind of, like, the snowballing was that I ended up having conversations with people that understood the plain nature of the law as opposed to the political framework which it was like, playing in.
Yeah. So kind of with like, the role of law and policy, I guess in the UK we do have, pretty strong rule of law. So legislation and policy, we can kind of rely on it as a good vehicle for change. But I think you've made the interesting point in the past, and a really important point, that a lot of the countries where FGM is practiced is actually legal.
Yeah.
So how do we actually tackle this practice?
So the whole thing is like, so the Foreign Office has a role to play, but then again it's about, so that's where the Five Foundation comes in. A lot of the African countries want legislation to change. They really want legislation to be part of their kind of core of how they protect their girls. So Kenya, for example, is the most successful place where bringing in the legislation has actually meant that, that girls are protected. So once you spell it out as being wrong, I think that's when you kind of get the change. But also you have to create the importance at a strategic level, in the sense that 250 million women, that's a lot of women, and we have these conversations about ending poverty. Poverty is an organized crime. It doesn't just actually, as I say that again, poverty just doesn't happen, in the sense that you have to be able to, like, carrying out FGM means that, say about 80% of the women in Gambia have undergone FGM. So that's 80% of your 50% of your natural resources, which are, and then you don't educate them, and then you don't, and then you allow child marriage. Poverty then happens. So it's about changing the institutional conversations into a gender kind of specific thing. So it's about holding the Foreign Office to account, to say, they talk about ending child poverty. I mean, you can't really end child poverty when you've got, that girl being mutilated. So those are the kind of conversations that we have to realise that as donors, as G7, as G7 members, as members of the Permanent Council and the Security Council, we have a duty of care to young women that their leaders don't have any care to. So once these these Commonwealth countries come around the table, it is for the UK to be able to say, well, this is how we progress, is by not mutilating children, by educating them, and by giving them access to employment. So that's the kind of key way to kind of do that. And then legislation also starts at that. But in the UK, it's one of those things where you just have to kind of push, because at the time of 2011 or 2012, when we really started the work, the Met had like 140 cases of FGM identified, and young girls had come to them, but they were just too embarrassed to be called racist to go and do any work around that. The whole point is, they were racist by not doing any of the work. Since then, we've had 2 prosecutions, and those prosecutions, because everybody's so embarrassed about the work that they haven't done for so long, have been incredibly hefty sentences. So I'm kind of a oxymoron in that sense, the fact that I do want the law to work, but I don't want a woman who's also been a victim of FGM herself to be sentenced to 11 years. I remember when the first conviction happened for FGM, and somebody said, how do you feel? And I said, well, it's quite a sad day, the fact that we're prosecuting, and 11 years is actually quite hefty. I've known men that have raped and killed women that don't get 11 years. So I think the way that the legislation is being used against women is also being very interesting in that sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess kind of going from the macro of like policy, and I guess zooming down to the micro, I know in your book you kind of have this really quite cathartic collection of 42 untold stories of women who've undergone, various, I guess, experiences, including FGM. How much do you feel that there is kind of open conversation, I guess, more internally between women, or just between, people who've undergone FGM, or is it still quite taboo and, you know, people don't feel it's something they can talk about?
No, I think it depends on the conversation. I think there is a poetic nature in the way, especially that African women communicate about forms of abuse, is that they don't actually talk about abuse as being abuse. I think there's this kind of, and I've sat there with my mother and her sisters and everybody else kind of talking. For me, I think my FGM is massively different to a lot of the kind of African activists that I've met, because there's a really weird love or some kind of relationship between the cutter and the person who's been, like, you know, subjected to FGM. And I say that because I've never known the conversation with one of my Gambian colleagues who basically in her film Jaha's Promise talks to her cutter, and there's this kind of, like, it's a really weird kind of thing which I don't have, because I was semi-British when I was cut, and came back and had this really kind of like, I really hate her and she's evil and all these other kind of conversations, which I've had to put at the back of my mind when I've actually started to have conversations with really pro-FGM people. But just soon after my grandmother passed away, God rest her soul, I went back to Somaliland, and my mother and her sister were there. And I decided that for the first time ever, I was going to meet a cutter. And I remember having this conversation with this cutter, and it's like, because for the first time I thought, I'm beyond FGM. I'm actually free of this in a way that you are not as the cutter. And then I came back and I was talking to my mum and my aunt, and said, oh, she looked terrible. I think it must be like all the kind of evil that she's done. She really did look evil herself. And then they started having a conversation about their cutter in a really kind of compassionate way, and said that they saw her in the market recently. So I think they do talk about their abuse. I think they do talk about these things, but it's just in a way which we're not privy to and understanding. And that's what I found in the book, is that very few of these women actually felt sorrow, but it was more of a cathartic kind of conversation. And they end up finding joy in life, which ironically I didn't have at the time, because I was, like, you know, so consumed by trying to make sure that funding was given to the right women and all these other kind of things. So yeah, so they are very open, but I think they're not open to the micro level where we're able to take their stories and make those the foundations of the change that we want to create. And I think there's a massive dismissal of African women's experiences because it's not written. So I think the academic world always acknowledges and always respects the written word over the, like, you know, over the oral storytelling. I think that's been the problem. So I think shame is something that is carried in the wider society, but I think within women's circles, I think they're very vocal about those conversations.
Yeah. So do you think there's almost kind of an irony that the person who actually does the cutting is also a woman, but, you know, you've spoken, it's these wider kind of structures of patriarchy that allow it to happen in the first place. So do you think the fact that it is kind of between women, does that contribute to the fact that it's able to continue to, you know, proliferate for so long?
It does, because then men can say, well, it's got nothing to do with me. And, like, you know, Noelle Adesalawi talks about in her book, where she says, like, you know, she basically, it's cut, she's really horrified, and then she looks for her mom, because, like, she's looking for the safety of her mother, and then she sees her mother in the corner cackling. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen Rosemary's Baby, but in that sense of where you, because the world rejects you have to kind of come back to that kind of instance. I think it is that kind of secret society conversation, and it's similar to in Sierra Leone and all those things. So I think women have kind of created this kind of community out of the abuse in order to keep themselves safe in a weird way. And I think that's why they have to be at the heart of the work to end FGM. But ultimately, it's also been a place where men have been able to say, well, it's got nothing to do with us. It's the women that are doing all the cutting kind of thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, from what you say, it's quite clear that the fight against FGM is inextricably linked with, you know, the feminist cause. So I think for a lot of us who would maybe self-identify as feminists, and I guess it can sometimes feel distant, but clearly not distant, you know, said hundreds of thousands of girls in the UK.
Yeah.
What can we actually do to help end this practice?
I think one of the key things is to elevate and stand in solidarity with African women as leaders, is that the global kind of funding, I think the world, like, you know, every time we take a step forward, I think there's a massive pushback. So there's no dissimilarity between the kind of the clampdown on access to abortion, access to sexual reproductive health rights on this side of the world as much as there is the increase in FGM. So I think it's really understanding that, like, you know, cliche that, like, you know, until all of us are free, none of us are free. And secondly, if we are going to go into the civil service or whatever you're going to do, especially as taxpayers, whatever you actually do, is to actually start articulating the fact that our funding and the money that we give in terms of intellectual development aid has to especially go to women of colour. So I think it's that whole conversation of really standing in solidarity and advocating for women of colour to be at the forefront of their own, changes.
Yeah, I think, as you said, your book really does that kind of work to expose the voices and get people to be able to engage with these women. It's such a diverse range of stories. I'm just kind of thinking, what was your inspiration to write? How did you go about gathering? You've got people from New York, Ethiopia, East London.
It's like the whole thing is somebody always says to me, Secretary of State always say to me, how did you get this to happen? I'm like, I've got good chat. I think one of the things I'm going to say to you, if you ever go into public life, good chat is the way to kind of have those kind of conversations. Like, I think one of the most randomest things I ever did was working with Mike Pompeo, I don't know, this is on camera, somebody who I don't agree with, let's just say, but ultimately as Secretary of State of the United Nations, as the United States, he was able to talk to Sudan about banning FGM, something that the UN could not do for 30 odd years, but we did in 6 months. So it's that ability to kind of have that conversation. So I've always had conversations with women and with people around the world. And then when Penguin first approached me and said, do you want to write a memoir? I was like, I can't. First of all, I'm not that old. And second of all, I can't be honest. Because the reality is that even in the book, I talk about my first sexual experience and all these other kind of things. And it's like, I want to be honest about things, but I know there are a lot of people that are out there that are just expecting me, because I don't fit within their framework of what a Muslim woman or what a Somali woman is, in order to use that to either oppress other women or to oppress me. So I was like, I can't do that. So I thought, you know what I'm going to do? There's a book called The Vagina Monologue, which is Eve Ensler, which I really used to like. But then the more and more I kind of read that book, I thought it's a white woman co-opting other people's stories. So I just wanted it to be a dialogue. So I just wanted these women, because I've gone through all stages of my femininity, like periods, orgasms, childbirth and menopause, all through as a woman who's had FGM, but there are other women's experiences. So I just wanted to kind of show, especially my editor and other people, that it's like that women are suffering in other spaces of life. So yeah, I've just always loved to have conversations. I've always been able to ask those kind of random questions, and I've never really been embarrassed about my anatomy. And I think that's it's a weird thing that I say, that when I had my defibrillation and I came home, my mum, it was so bizarre. It's so bizarre sometimes when you go at these things. My mum stood over me and she's like, you can't tell anyone that you've had this done. And I was like, why would I talk about my vagina? And I'm thinking, like 30 years later, that's the only thing that I ever kind of talk about. So it's like, I've always been this curious kind of person, and I think weirdly enough, FGM had made me more interested in the femininity of womanhood than if I'd never had FGM. I think I would have been a less precocious and more troublemaking person had I not had FGM. And the irony is that FGM is meant to make you more controllable, and it's made me more of a louder person.
Yeah. So you talked about kind of your own experiences with defibrillation, and one of the stories is of Amana in your book, a Gambian woman who was defibrillated in a clinic in New York. So is it kind of common for FGM or related surgical procedures to actually occur in clinical environments?
Yeah, so it's like, I think there's even within the kind of context of since 2022, I think it kind of really changed, was the fact that women were able to kind of have their defibrillations in the UK. It was just like normal, so nobody asked those questions. So most of my friends, my colleagues and stuff, all had their defibrillations just before they got married. And the interesting thing about the Gambian story is that we talk about child marriage. Like, child marriage is still legal in US, states. So the whole point was this girl was able to be trafficked from Gambia to the US legally as a wife and then be defibrillated. So I think there's that kind of cross-cultural abuse that's kind of ignored. That wouldn't happen in the UK. You'd have to be 16 until 2023 in order to be able to be married or come here as a wife.
I know you've called kind of your book The Vagina Dialogue, that we've all been waiting for. So would you say kind of there's been a progress in attitudes or openness to speaking about kind of women's sexual health and well-being. I guess British society is quite known for being prude, maybe a bit more embarrassed to talk about these things openly.
Well, do you know what? We kind of go the extreme kind of way, because my other half is American, Somali American. But have you ever seen Naked Attraction? It's like, he was like, what is this? And it is, what is this? It's the fact that the UK, we try to be so comical about trying to talk about serious stuff that we go the complete other way. So we get really, like, you know, crass about it. I think we are more open about this whole kind of conversation. And in 2020, the first consultation was done for the Women's Health Strategy. I think one of the interesting things about the UK is that, and so the NHS is 75 years old, but didn't have a women's health strategy till 2020. Well, it started in 2020, then COVID happened, and then it got shelved because women don't really matter. So then it was 2022, it happened. I think we're getting better. But what happened is the fact that as soon as we're able to have these conversations, then porn and all these kind of other extreme things kind of come in. So we've kind of now shied away. I think, which is really sad. Like, young people now are exposed to more sexual content and more things that we would find as like, oh my God, that's really forward. But it's not informational and it's not educational, and therefore they're more scared and more, like, you know, holding back about their kind of health. Like, you know, girls are still dying from cervical cancer, which is kind of a treatable disease. So I think we are getting better, but we have to be able to have a more informed conversation that actually contributes to things like consent and our sexual reproductive health, rather than just like seeing vaginas everywhere. So it's like, it's different. I wanted us to talk about the vagina, but I didn't want it to be like on Channel 4 News or whatever, on that Channel 4 show where we have to pick which vagina we like or not. That is not the kind of progression that I was hoping for.
Yeah, so I guess, do you think that, you know, as people who are kind of part of communities where FGM is practiced, but maybe we don't have a direct kind of family member who's undergone it, do you think that maybe there is a difficulty to kind of conceive of it? Or do you feel that, you know, with people who are kind of third generation, fourth generation of immigrants, do you think that they're aware of the practice still, or because they don't really have a personal connection to it, that there's maybe even a lack of awareness within those very communities and not just outside?
I think they're aware, but I think just like me, we're sometimes embarrassed to talk about it because of the way that we're going to really deal with it. And it's like, it's one of the things was the fact that I was like, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. And it was really like irritated at the beginning when I used to do when I would do an interview. It's like they just wanted to know the gory details. I'm like, no, we're here to change policy, we're here to kind of do those kind of things. So I think a lot of people are kind of embarrassed, and I don't think just because you're a survivor of FGM or you're from those communities that you should have to talk about it. I think one of the kind of key things that I wanted to talk about was, what I really don't want is for every young black girl to be looked at and said, oh, you have FGM, so then we're going to have a conversation with you. That is not what I want, and that's not what the campaigning that I did was about. It was about saying the fact that we are going to take precautions in order to keep you safe and to keep you identified within the law. So I do think young people are aware of it, but I don't think we've kind of destigmatized the whole kind of issue. And also I don't really want any survivor to feel that they have to talk about it or they have to be the educator of the issue.
Yeah. So you've kind of spoken about there effectively being two strands to your activism, you know, first of all creating visibility about FGM and their survivors, and two, you know, actually ending the practice. So is this kind of a spectrum or kind of two things that you do simultaneously, and kind of how far along would you say you are with kind of ending FGM itself?
Well, ending FGM, I think that's going to be really difficult. It depends on what the Foreign Office does. It's really interesting. I think the big kind of what's the word? The biggest hurdle that we have at the moment is the ability to kind of decolonize and really get the concept of racism, well, not the concept of racism, but the racist ideologies within the way that we fund within the Foreign Office out of the way, because the problem is that we're doing really well in the UK. That's great. This has all been put into the institutions. It's in NHS. It's in education. But the whole point is, in order for there to be a global reduction of FGM, there has to be real substantial funding towards African women-led organisations, and that is not happening at the moment because they just believe that African women are not able to do this work, and it's like, it's incredibly offensive, the fact that they would trust an intern with leading a program than an African woman that knows what she's doing. So we're not going to end FGM without any funding, and I think it's incredibly tactless, and it's incredibly unhelpful to kind of expect African women to work for free in order to kind of do this work. So I think there is a tangible reality in terms of ending FGM, but that needs financing, and that financing has to come from our institutions like the Foreign Office that are not doing the work at the moment.
Yeah. So kind of what would you say is your biggest win? Working with Daughters of Eve, the Five Foundation, you work as an independent advisor for women's health. What's kind of your biggest achievement, you think?
I think it's just overcoming that fear of being able to speak to power and being able to tell them that they're kind of doing things wrong. But I think on a personal level, and you were just saying, I'm interested enough about the FGM. I have a niece that's 13, and I have a little cousin that's 15, about to be 16. And FGM to them is just 3 letters. I think they know the concept of what it is, that it's bad, but they don't know the ins and outs of it. So I think that's my kind of personal win in that whole kind of sense. And I think the main kind of thing that makes me laugh and it's really funny is the fact that I can sit in front of African leaders and talk about vaginas. It was really funny. There was a specific president recently, and he's like, every time you come, you only want to talk about your issues. I'm like, that's my work. If you want me to talk about your membership to something, then you need to deliver something, on that standpoint. And I think I've kind of ended up having a lot more respect for a lot of African leaders because we've been able to have that personal conversation about their kind of struggles in terms of trying to end violence against women and girls.
Thank you. So we're going to move to the moderated Q&A now. So if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to ask now.
Thank you very much for coming to talk to us. I'm just kind of generally wondering what sort of impact kind of FGM has on kind of the relationship between the girl and her family kind of going forward. Because generally it's a family that kind of...
Does it, yeah. I think it depends on the context where it's done. Like when it's done, the girls are taken away and then brought back, and there's this kind of nuclear family in the UK or whatever, there's always that kind of that push there is a deterioration of the relationship. I remember one of the most interesting things was the fact that when I was in counter-terrorism, they were talking about gangs in London, and they said, there's only one girl gang. And they used to stand outside this Tesco's in Stonebridge. So I'm being very specific about London, but it was just so I went there at lunchtime, and I went to go see to see this girl gang, and it was a gang of, and it was just a bunch of Somali girls in tracksuits, and I thought, this is not a gang. These are girls who don't belong in their family because they've got completely different cultures, and they've been alienated from the country which they thought was their home. So I think what it's done is it's kind of created this kind of middle ground where a lot of these young people don't belong. So that's probably created that most of these survivors have actually have had a real hard time, and I think that becomes evident when they have their own children and the kind of the trauma in that. So I think when those that have gone through FGM live in the diaspora, I think there is a bigger family breakdown than when they're back home in Africa, because then you can at least give the whole kind of texture of everybody's been cut and this is part of your culture, this is an act of love and so on. So I think it depends on the diaspora and those that are at home, but within the diaspora it's massively impactful. And even for me, obviously I realised that my mother was 27 when I had FGM, so she had very little control over that, but she had a lot of control in how I was educated and raised in this country. And I was very much freely educated. I was very much allowed to do a lot of the things I wanted to do. And I remember, my mum and I didn't talk for at least 3 years when I first started my FGM activism. And I realised it's because what I did with the voice that she kind of helped me get into be educated how I was to use it to fight against something that she had no control over. So I realised that actually it was about me forgiving my mother, then my mother demanding forgiveness from me. But I think it takes a lot of work to kind of do that. And yeah, I think it's kind of broken a lot of relationships that they could have been a lot stronger. But again, that's in the diaspora, not back home.
More questions?
So I guess you've talked about how policy change can finally move us towards getting rid of FGM, but how do we address the more individual attitudes towards FGM within these communities? Do you think there's a disconnect, or?
I think, do you know what the disconnect is from where we deliver the what's it called, the policy, because what happens is that's still that anthropological kind of look, it's still kind of stopping things. So for example, Bristol, where I'm from, there is a lot of pushback against actually criminalising FGM. And you would think that's crazy, because like if any other form of abuse was happening, people would be like, that's like, we need to stop that. I remember a counsellor coming up to me, and a Somali guy coming up to me, and he was like, well, we don't know FGM is wrong and you need to educate us about it. And I said, do you have a parking permit? And he said, yes. I said, do you send your kids to school? Yes. I said, if you know the basic civilities of living in this country, then you know FGM is wrong. So I think that kind of like from policy to down, we need to be a little bit more stronger in the sense of saying, actually, these things are wrong. You are not allowed to do this. This is a human rights violation. These kids are British. These kids are born here. But that's not happening, I think, because at the local level, a lot of people have to see those families, and those families have to trust them. So they've been uncomfortable in being as hardline as I think, like, you know, other European countries would have been.
You've spoken about how you oppose kind of Western, like countries like the UK coming to African countries and telling them what to do, basically, in the context of decolonization. But at the same time, you've worked very closely with leaders in the UK and elsewhere in the West to try and put pressure to end the practice of FGM. How do you balance those two things?
So I think, like, you know, there's a duty of care of UK politicians to end FGM within the UK. So the whole point is that if you have a child protection policy, if you have a violence against women and girls policy, those things have to also include all women from all cultures. From the international perspective, my thing is the fact that just because the way that we end FGM here in the UK is not how you end FGM in Gambia. It's not how you end FGM in Sierra Leone. But there are women organisations that have been leading that conversation. So even when it comes to the definition of FGM, it was African women that took it to the UN. So for me, it's like, let's actually separate that. Let's, like, you know, support and fund these women's organisations, but let's not go there. It's like, it's really, really crazy. Sometimes it's the fact that they will think that it's about whatever, like, a Western person says, like, oh, we're gonna end FGM through the lens of community dialogue. I said, well, you can't do that if the community leaders are cutters and men, because they already hold the power. So it's about the conversations of actually identifying, like, feminist leaders within those communities and supporting them, because it's the same thing as the fact that I was supported as a feminist leader to be able to go into the UK government and kind of change that. So I think the UK has a massive role to play in ending FGM in Africa, but that role is funding women. It is not about them doing the work, because when they do the work, then it does 100% backfire.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your stories. It's so inspiring and eye-opening to hear. I was also wondering if you could shed a little bit more light on the prevalence of FGM in other Muslim-majority countries, other parts of the world. If there have been statistics on that, or India?
Yeah, Indonesia and Malaysia have a massive uptake of FGM, and one of the main problems about the FGM prevalence work at the beginning was it was because of the World Health Organization that led with it. It was because there was a crisis on women dying when giving birth as a result of FGM, especially type 3. So it was seen as a health issue. It wasn't seen as a human rights issue. Then what happened was countries like Egypt, for example, started to medicalize FGM within Africa, and Sudan did the same. And, like, you know, those are the two kind of big countries. But both Indonesia and Malaysia are fundamentally medicalized processes, and they've kind of called it female circumcision and not FGM. So again, it's about the terminology of the way that we use. I think they would, like, in most programs, they spend at least like half of the program looking for the definition of the terminology, but it is mutilation because it's a consequence of it. So Indonesia and Malaysia, with their population, is actually, like, you know, massive. It's like, for example, Nigeria has a large uptake of FGM in terms of population, in terms of percentage. It's about 24%. So, but the main kind of countries outside of Africa are Indonesia and Malaysia.
Thank you.
Unfortunately.
Got any more questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, within the UK, when using dialogue, is your main priority generally to raise awareness of how widespread it is within the UK, or is it to reach the people who currently practice or kind of support FGM?
I think my position in the UK at the moment is to basically get the Foreign Office to just change its funding spectrum and kind of say that the work to end FGM on a global level it's on the African continent. So that's the kind of key conversation. Like the Foreign Office has put in a women first policy now, so everything has to go through the gender lens, but many of those things are actually still coming against the whole funding spectrum. There's this really weird theory that because they're spending public money, then the public need to know where every penny is going. But at the moment, is they're able to account for every penny, but the impact is negligible. I think those are the kind of conversations that are going to come into. It's interesting enough. I think that's going to be a very big conversation within the next general election. Is not going to be defence. It's about our foreign aid spending. Is the fact that we do spend a lot of money, but much of that is not impactful. And I remember getting a lot of pushback from the massive INGOs when the 0.7% was going to go down to 0.5%, and then we were going to get rid of the international development department. It was like Africa's going to suffer. I'm like, Africa's not really going to suffer because Africa doesn't get the money. Africa's allocated the money. Africa very solemnly gets the money that's impactful. So the conversations with the UK is that at the moment, because they are doing very well in terms of preventing FGM, because they've got all the kind of guidelines in terms of child protection. It's been added to the Children's Act. They've got the mandatory reporting, so all health and kind of teachers have to report FGM now. Before it was like, do I report it, do I not? Now it's a duty of care, and they will be they will lose their profession if they don't. So I think we've been quite successful in the UK.
Any more questions? Right. Well, thank you very much, Nimco. That was just such an enlightening talk, and I think everyone here has definitely learned a lot more about FGM, and also just keep going and keep fighting, because it's such an incredibly important cause. So we're now going to move to the drinks reception. So downstairs, if you'd like to stay and talk personally to Nimco or kind of socialise more with other members of society, you'll have the chance to do that. But yeah, I think just thank you so much.